I want to explain to our esteemed global leader here, John Kerry, that this is the round room where the first government of the sort of independent Ireland was held illegally or informally long before the treaty discussions took place. I want to say that you're very welcome.
Thank you.
Really welcome. I've admired you for many years as a serious statesman with global impact. But I'm going to tell you a little story before we get into the reasons why you're here and your experiences as Secretary of State and as Climate Czar. In this country here, we have two traditional games. One is hurling and the other is Gaelic football. I come from County Mayo, right on the west coast, a county that hasn't won this All-Ireland Championship since 1951. The trophy is called after a great nationalist, Sam Maguire. So everybody in Ireland knows who Sam is. I had to explain to President Biden last year that Sam is not a surface-to-air missile, but a trophy that the Irish play for. Now, I know you're an optimist, and so am I, given the responsibilities that we had. In 2004, my beloved county got into the All-Ireland football final, and the county that they were playing was none other than Kerry. And the Kerry people are known as living in the Kingdom of Kerry, and they've won All-Ireland titles over the years. And when I was driving to Dublin on the day of the final with my wife and 3 small children, outside Longford was a very large sign saying, "Kerry for the White House and Mayo for Sam." So despite the fact that we are two optimists, neither of those things came through or true on that time.
You should have been driving in Columbus, Ohio, getting people to the vote.
Anyway, John, you're really welcome here. First of all, there are some instances in international politics that make their mark. You have a few years on me, but I remember the Vietnam War being on television. And I remember your powerful oration and contribution to the hearing committee in Washington on the 23rd of April, 1971. And you made the point about you want to be the last American to die for a mistake. And you made the point that in 30 years' time from then, you walk down the street in Vietnam, you see your brothers without an arm or a leg, and the young boys ask, why? You want to be able to say, Vietnam, but not as a desert or an obscene place, but as a place where America went back and helped to turn it in the right direction. So was there a point in your young life as a boat commander where you suddenly felt, actually, this is the wrong thing we're doing, this is a mistake, and your mind turned the other way, and you followed through on that with the hearings in the Senate and your very strong views afterwards?
Wow, that's a mite distant from impact investing today, but it brings back a lot of memories. It wasn't one single moment or one single event. I graduated from college in 1966, and I volunteered to go into service because I just didn't feel like I wanted to go to graduate school at that point. And you know, there's a great tradition of service. This is now the earlier 1960s, 66, 67. 67, I was in uniform. I'd already had my hair shorn and gone through boot camp and done what you do. And the country was not yet that focused on Vietnam. I think in 1967, the first draft card was burned. The first major demonstration where people threw blood on the steps of the Pentagon, people may remember that. And that was sort of an awakening of polarization in the country. And that's when the draft began to be felt and take a change. And the reason I say all that is, you know, my generation was sort of just a notch away from the folks who already knew and were demonstrating against it. So in 68, I was already headed towards Vietnam. One tour of duty I did was on a big ship, a frigate in the Gulf of Tonkin, and we were doing pilot plane guard work with the aircraft carriers. But the next tour of duty, I was commander of a 50-foot gunboat, which had originally been purposed to guard the flow of arms coming from North Vietnam and Thailand and places into Vietnam. And, but very quickly when I got there, just about the same day I got there, we started going up the rivers, only the rivers. We only saw the ocean or the sea, South China Sea, transiting from the mouth of one river to another. And the whole war changed for us, but that was not what most affected me. What most affected me was the clarity with which I could see that this war was not what we'd been told by our leaders in Washington and elsewhere. It was a civil war, not a war, you know, and a surrogate war for, you know, a proxy war with respect to great powers, Russia, China, et cetera. But much more importantly, it was sort of the crescendo of US fixation on the Cold War and Cold War mentality. And so there was an extension of that Cold War thinking to Vietnam. Oh my God, if Vietnam goes, everything else goes in the region, which couldn't have been further from the truth. And we had to learn it the hard way. We learned it firsthand. But it just was so clear to me. You know, I'd traveled a fair amount as a young man before graduation, and I'd seen other countries, so I didn't approach it. I wasn't like some of the kids who were there, who came out of Iowa or Minnesota off a farm, and they'd never been anywhere, and suddenly they were killing people or being killed. And to me, it was just clear that America had made a huge mistake. This was a civil war. It was a war in which most of the people of Vietnam had no clue about the politics or the geostrategic or anything. They just wanted to be left alone, farm, and deal with their lives. And it was a war in which we killed over 1 million civilians, and we lost 58,000 plus US, you know, servicemen. And it didn't have to happen. And I just summarize it by saying to you, that Neil Sheehan wrote the brilliant book about Vietnam, which I didn't read until 4 or 5 years after I was back and had already led veterans against the war and determined that I was opposed to it. But the book is called Bright Shining Lie. And if you haven't read it, you should read it because it traces the early 1950s with President Kennedy all the way up through Eisenhower, Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, where it was really hubris and a kind of arrogance and the lack of knowledge, literally not understanding the country and knowing what was happening. Remembering, of course, that Ho Chi Minh wrote a letter to Truman asking for help to develop a democracy, and to a famous letter in which he quoted the Constitution of the United States. He wanted something different. And we just couldn't see it that way with John Foster Dulles and the whole period of time. So I came back, and the first thing I did was actually become involved in Earth Day, 1970, when we changed the world, frankly, based on inspiration of Rachel Carson, 1962 book, The Silent Spring. And that was what motivated a whole bunch of us to become involved in this movement. So we brought 20 million Americans out of their homes on one single day, Earth Day, 1970, and translated that into a political movement where we targeted the 12 worst environmental votes in the United States Congress. We labeled them the Dirty Dozen after the movie of that period of time, and we defeated 7 of the 12. And guess what happened? The survivors all understood suddenly that this was a voting issue. And we passed the Clean Air Act, the Safe Drinking Water Act, the Marine Mammal Protection Act, the Coastal Zone Management Act, the Endangered Species Act, and we created, for the first time ever in the US, the Environmental Protection Agency. That all came out of citizen action and citizen activity, which is why I've been so active on this issue of climate, because all of you are focusing on impact investing.
Well, we'll come to that, and thank you for your response in respect of that issue, John. Now, you're here to receive the Impact Ireland Award, but I know that you're here as well because you're really interested in the kinds of companies that Impact Ireland are investing in. Maybe you might say a bit about that, and maybe you might reflect upon your time as climate change czar, if you like, in how prepared America is to actually get to net zero figures here, given the polarization and the withdrawal of many public companies of their money. So the companies here, your views on that, where that's headed, and in your own country, what's the real story?
Well, this is a terrific question, and I want to preface it, if I may, if you'll permit me. I just want to give you a little prologue as we get into this discussion because it's relevant. And I hope genuinely we'll have some of you leaving here feeling like this really was an important gathering, which I believe it is, which is why I'm here. And I think every gathering like this of private sector leaders is the key at this point in time, and I'll tell you why I say that. But please let me put this into what I think is a critical structure by which you begin to approach and think about ESG and all these other things which I heard Edge talking about a moment ago. I've been at this in earnest since 1988, when Al Gore, myself, a bunch of senators, young and aggressive back then, inspired by the things I talked about earlier, we had a hearing which we put together, which brought Jim Hansen from NASA to the Congress. And we listened to Jim Hansen in 1988 say, here's what's happening. This is happening now. And if you read Rachel Carson, you can see that even in 1952, she warned about the potential of climate change as a result of what we were doing. So in 1992, took us 4 years later, we held the first ever UN conference in Rio, the Earth Summit, as it was called. George H.W. Bush flew down there with his entourage, with his team, and signed an agreement, along with the leaders of the rest of the world, saying, we have to deal with the climate change. And then it was just change, global warming change. Now it's crisis, and legitimately so. So that journey took us to Kyoto, where in Kyoto, 7 or 8 years later, we tried to come up with a structure which would bring nations to the table to deal with the crisis. And we couldn't get anybody to agree to a mandatory structure by which you had to reduce or you had to live by a global standard. They just weren't going to do it. Politics, ideology, a whole bunch of things got in the way. So in later years, we had successive COPs, as they are called, the Conference of the Parties. And we're now obviously at number 29, 29th meeting since we've been aware that this problem is happening. So the context I want to put this in is this. We've been told for 30 years, this is existential. We've been told for 30 years what's going to happen. And every bit of that prediction of what is going to happen is not only happening, but happening bigger, faster, more destructive than was predicted. So it's not a case where I have to come and buttress the scientific findings. I have to come and remind people that if it is indeed existential, then we have to behave like it's existential. And we're not. We're behaving like it's another issue, whatever happens. More oil, more gas, more drilling, more burning. The burning is the problem, by the way. This is not a complicated issue. We don't need a new rocket scientist to come up with a new algorithm that tells us what's happening. And if you look at what's happening, it's very clear that it's going to cost a huge amount of lives. Already, 8 million people are dying every year because of the air quality, and that air quality is affected by pollution, which is what greenhouse gases are. And so we're seeing that it's the burning of the fuel. We've decided we're going to light our buildings and our offices, and we're going to live the way we want to live. And I'm not, mind you, there's nothing in the way I approach this that is saying to you, you got to sacrifice, you got to give up this, you got to give up that. You lead a better life. You can actually have cleaner air. You can actually have a healthier world. A lot less money being spent on the healthcare costs of what comes with black lung disease or all the other ancillary impacts of cancer and so forth that come from pollution. But we're not even doing that. So, you know, we have this, I heard Edge mention ESG. ESG is a phony fight, folks. It's a construct that has been put in front of us by people who are making it a regular fare of politics that you weaponize certain things and scare the hell out of people. And so a whole bunch of people who don't want to change, even a presidential candidate in the United States believes that climate crisis is a hoax, and he's going to pull out of Paris again. So this is real. This is about as big a confrontation of reality at an inflection point as you can get in life. And if you want your grandchildren and children to live in a world where it's livable, we have to move faster than we are today to do the things that we've said we're going to do. I'm not asking you to do something you haven't said you're going to do. But you look at these meetings and the tension of shareholders who are screaming at some CEO because he's trying to do net zero 2050 and beats them up, or the shareholders are saying, well, the other guys are funding fossil fuel, why don't you? Is created, and then secretaries of states or treasurers in certain states who say, if you are going to invest in this, you're not going to do any business with you. And they're trying to scare you. Well, let me ask you something. Does Larry Fink and BlackRock have more lawyers and more money and more ability to counter them and lawyer the hell out of them and make them back off of what is unconstitutional activity? Of course. And if you all and people in business join together to unite to say, we're not going to stand for that, don't bully us. If you want your state to be way behind in terms of economy and health and safety and security, you go ahead. But I'm going to listen to people who know that insurance companies are pulling out of states and are now saying we're not going to be able to fund, we're not going to insure you there. And you know that's happening. And supply chains will be affected. Look at what happened with Helene. You know why Helene is such a dangerous storm? Because 90% of the heating of the planet goes into the ocean. And that 90% is returning, coming out with a boiling hot ocean, measured at 101 degrees Fahrenheit off Key West last summer. That's hot tub heat. And so, you know, now we see all the species moving and going to different locations, such as we now have great whites off of Massachusetts, which we didn't used to have. As the fish migrate, the whole ocean chemistry is changing. So I bring this back. So how do we now turn this around? What is the challenge? Well, there are three critical ingredients, I think, to dealing with this crisis. And believe me, as I sit here, I do believe we can win this. We still have time to win it. but it is really shrinking dangerously. In 2018, the IPCC, some 2,000 scientists, said to the world in their latest report that we have 12 years within which to make the decisions and implement them that can avoid the worst consequences of the crisis. They didn't say you can avoid the crisis, you can avoid the worst consequences. So we're now at 6 years. We've got 6 years left. In Dubai, we built on what we did in Glasgow and Sharm el-Sheikh, where we reached agreement that we have to do more. We raised global ambition. The NDCs, National Determined Contributions, came in stronger. President Biden challenged nations to deal with methane for the first time. I couldn't believe myself, actually, I plead guilty, that for years we were talking about CO2 and we're talking about greenhouse gases, but we weren't focused on methane. Methane is 20 to 80 times more damaging and destructive than CO2. And methane now, because of the thawing of the permafrost in Siberia and in Alaska and other northern places, is now, you can see the land undulating where it's shifting because of the thawing. And you can see the buildings that have cracks in them. But most dangerous, you have fugitive gas, methane that just rises up out of the earth and goes up in the atmosphere and goes to work on that 20 to 80% more destructive. So we have to find a way to try to deal with that. We got a whole world. We started with 20 nations in Glasgow, and lo and behold, we're at 156 nations now have agreed to deal with methane plans. Even China came on board last year. We had a 4-day negotiation in sunny lands in California. China agreed for the first time. They will include all greenhouse gases in their next NDC. They haven't been. That includes methane. And they will accelerate in this decade to begin to try to turn their emissions down. And they agreed that they are going to implement a national methane plan in China. You know what China's doing today as we sit here? China has manufactured and deployed more renewable energy in the last few years than all of the rest of the world put together. So why do I say this is so important? Because the 3 ingredients that we need more than anything are, number 1, we have to recognize that the policy has to be right. We do need policy. And part of that policy ought to include a pricing of carbon. It is insane that we can't do that, but we can't. Not going to happen in the near term, because politicians will say it's a tax, and you're the taxing party, and you're the not. And so you get gridlock instead of a wise decision. So number 1, you need some policy. IRA, not the one you don't want to hear about here, but the Inflation Reduction Act is an incredible incentive. Maybe 88 new battery companies in the United States alone because of the IRA. So that's a policy. We need that kind of policy to continue to drive action. Number 2, we need citizens and people, you, business leaders, to be pushing everywhere you can. You shouldn't contribute to one congressman or senator if they're not out front trying to lead on this and get something done. And we need public efforts like we did in Earth Day, where we held people accountable and changed the outcome. And the 3rd, private sector. I said it as Secretary of State, I said it as Senator, and I've said it as Climate Envoy. We can't do this without the private sector. No country has enough money to affect this transition. Just not going to happen. And budgets are under pressure and duress everywhere. You got Ukraine, you got the Middle East, you've got all kinds of challenges. So how do we get people, even in the midst of that, to focus in here? Well, the private sector, the marketplace is moving. You're moving. And it's individual startups and companies like you represent here or are represented in many other parts of the world now that are going to win this battle, I am convinced. Providing we continue to push in the other ways and don't go backwards in terms of public policy. So who does have enough money to invest? You do. The private sector of the world. And if we can create enough incentives and show people that there is money to be made in this transition, this is the largest economic opportunity we've had staring us in the face since the Industrial Revolution, literally, honestly. And we are seeing now more and more companies that are finding that there really is the virtue of meeting your target for, 20%, 25%, 30%, whatever. That's being met by companies that are smart and that are working at this transition. The key now, my friends, is to accelerate the transition. And 200 nations came together, almost 200 in Dubai. And here's what we agreed on. We must transition away from fossil fuel in a manner that is orderly, fair, and equitable. And in order to achieve net zero by 2050, according to the science, and according to the science means trying to hold 1.5 degrees where the 2018 IPCC report said, and finally, most importantly, it said accelerating in this decade. And even China stepped up and said, yeah, we agree, we're accelerating. And they're doing it. Enda, they're doing it in the way I described. So my friends, there's a lot we can talk about. We blended finance.
Thanks for that. I listened to a podcast on the BBC in which you were speaking to young people in Addis Ababa. Mm-hmm. Given what you have outlined here, there's a heat warning today in San Francisco for a second extreme summer, 97 degrees. People stay indoors in air-conditioned rooms, drink plenty of water, look after your neighbors. Fires, as you mentioned. 30 million tons of ice falling from Greenland into the North Atlantic per hour. The whole Antarctic shelf beginning to move. So your perspective as a global figure on the requirement of the kind of leadership that's necessary to bring people from all sides together in the interests of our common humanity. What would be John Kerry's message to the young people of the world? I heard you speak to the young people of Africa and say it's not, as Kennedy said, it's what we can do for you, but what are you going to do for yourself here? As a young man, you did your business in Vietnam, Earth Day, change in legislation, change in government. Given that the situation is now more uncertain, more confused, more challenging, more provocative, what's the Kerry message to the young people for whom this is a real generational issue?
Well, young people have been the leaders of every major shift. They were the leaders of the anti-war movement, of the environment movement, of the women's movement, of the peace movement in the 1960s, and beyond. And then there was a period of time where some decided that the world's problems had been solved, and they went off and said, let's take care of ourselves. I think that's not true of the current generation at all. They're ready. They are hungry, desperate. They have leadership and have people put the right choices on the table. And I think it's a mistake for politicians who aren't prepared. Some aren't. Some are scared of the climate issue. That's partly because of the weaponization that's taken place so that people feel, well, if I talk about climate, people think I'm telling them they can't eat meat or they can't drive a car. Or, it's the negativity and the disinformation that has created a harder playing field for you. And that's a tragedy. So we have to stand up and point out to people how, in fact, the future is by facts defined to be much more sensible and much more doable than they're currently being told. To wit, health, as this crisis grows, what you're just hearing about California, I hadn't actually heard that, but I'm not surprised. There were places that were 50 degrees centigrade during the course of this summer. And human body just wasn't designed to work in that kind of heat outdoors. And there are studies that show that as the warmer it gets, you get up to 80 degrees, people now in Ireland or in America, whatever, would have a harder time working. There's about a 20% drop off in productivity. as the temperature goes up at 80 degrees. You start getting up to 90 and 100, 110. Phoenix, Arizona was 110 degrees for 31 days last year. I don't know what it was this year, but 110 degrees for 31 days. The pavement was melting. You know, I mean, the consequences of this are obviously enormous, and all of you tap into that, so I'll try to stay away from that. But here's what is key. We're seeing, for instance, solar has gone down about 99% almost in the last 15 years in price. Solar is now solar plus, which is storage. And the storage is getting better. If we get to 2 or 3 days of storage, folks, we win this fight. And we're narrowing up now where we're seeing we can balance energy grid and provide what's called firm energy to people on a regular basis. Germany is now up to 50% of its industrialized energy base being provided by renewables. And their goal is to get up to 80%. I want you to think about that. Here's a country that has big steel industry, big automotive industry, et cetera. They're the third largest economy in the world, $4 trillion GDP, which, by the way, just to give you a sense of the imbalance here, US is a $28 trillion economy. China is an $18 trillion economy, and the two next closest economies are Germany and Japan at about $4 trillion each. So to come back to what Enda said about sort of how do you do that, what do you say to people? I mentioned the words fair and equitable and orderly. It's not going to be orderly if tens of millions of people no longer have food production capacity in Africa, which is a threat, and they're wandering the planet looking for a place to live. And you know where they're going to go. They're not going to bang on Saudi Arabia to live in the desert. They're going to bang on the countries that have trees and lakes and streams and water and life. Now, when people talk about dealing with the climate crisis and investing, for instance, and you talk about investing in the less developed world or emerging economies, it's obviously harder. It's harder investing. And there are certain risks that we need to de-risk, and we could with the right policy and the right effort. So if you had this is where we did some blended finance. I negotiated the Indonesia Jet P and the Vietnam Jet P, and we tried to get there with South Africa. We did get there with Indonesia and with Vietnam. We now have to get them to implement, follow up on it. But what we did was we greased the skids a little by raising about $500 million of concessionary funding. We brought some philanthropy to the table. We were able to de-risk in other ways and got the MDBs. MDBs could do a lot more if we're going to show the seriousness of purpose that we ought to be here. There ought to be a lot of pressure being put on the NDBs. The World Bank, we did change and put Ajay Banga in as an effort to try to open it up, to provide more capital, to make a difference. But mind you, folks, the less developed world, global south, as people call it, whatever, deserves every bit of attention that it should get in this. And I'm for trying to encourage greater investment there, and I think you can work things out. Dr. Sultan Al-Jaber of the UAE and I are planning to work together to try to go to some of those countries and help make a difference and do some of the de-risking. But those developing countries, only a few of them are critical to the making a difference here. For instance, Brazil, Indonesia, a few others. 48 sub-Saharan African states equal 0.55% of all the world's emissions. 20 countries, led by US, China, Germany, Japan, et cetera, Russia, you know who they are. 20 countries equal about 80% of all the emissions. So we can go beat our heads, and I'm going to, and we should try to do some investing in the South, obviously, it's important, but that's not going to win this battle. What wins this battle is the developed world doing what's necessary to meet the target of a 43 to 50% reduction of emissions by 2030, and then to get to net zero 2050.
And that's why Europe and America have to be very working together
Very close.
with these specific targets. Now, I'm going to run over time here, but I got two questions for you. It would be remiss of me, given your exceptional work as Secretary of State, the most traveled Secretary of State ever, if I didn't ask you to make a brief comment upon how close you were to sorting out the Israeli-Palestinian business a number of years ago under President Obama's instruction. I know how hard you worked. I'd like you to give maybe 2 or 3 minutes of a reflection on where you were and just where it's drifted to now.
Well, thank you, and thanks for your help and others. There were a lot of good players involved in that. I had about 150 people we put together at the CIA, Defense Department, State Department, Homeland Security, FBI, everybody who somehow could touch providing security to Israel. And we worked, General John Allen, who was our commander in Afghanistan, took on the job of leading that effort. And we had, Prime Minister Netanyahu assured me that he was serious and wanted to try to get something done. President Abbas and the PA, pretty dysfunctional then, they're even more dysfunctional now, but they said they were prepared to go forward. So we put together a plan that really had the greatest defense structure you could conceivably give a country. We had Aegis tethered balloons that could target 350 individual targets simultaneously. King Abdullah agreed to have a double fence on the Jordan River with paths that were 24/7 being inspected by a combination of Jordanian, Israeli, other forces. Everywhere we could, we had the prospect of Shin Bet, Mossad, IDF working closely together with the Palestinians to build capacity, to do what had not been done in years. We put together an economic package. I got McKinsey Company to give us their best thinking on how we could change the dynamic where nothing was being developed, nothing was happening. People were impoverished and living, in a frozen state. And we managed to get agreement. The Allenby Bridge would open 24/7. The Wataniya communication system would go in here in the north, and so forth. None of that happened. And we, meanwhile, were watching while the settlers were building out the West Bank, contrary to the Oslo Accords of 1993. So we had a land swap arrangement, which King Abdullah agreed to, President el-Sisi agreed to, we agreed, and our allies, Europe agreed, et cetera, would have put 90 to 95% of all the settlers would have suddenly been in Israel with this swap, so you wouldn't have to move them. They could stay right where they were. Mm-hmm. And so we had a secret summit in Aqaba with King Abdullah, President el-Sisi, Bibi, myself. And, unfortunately, the Prime Minister walked in and said, I can't do it, I'm not going to do it, having assured us that he was prepared to even lose his coalition in the effort to do it. Now, obviously, folks, October 7th changes a lot. October 7th produced as grisly and depraved, misogynistic and sick rage level that begged for revenge and retaliation. And one has to clearly respect the feelings in Israel that have been impacted as a consequence. I mean, the nation is in trauma from that, and it's still fighting on several fronts, many fronts. The key is that it's going to take a while now. The equation has to change slightly. But I'll tell you what was happening in my judgment, and it's just my judgment. We went from 100,000 settlers when the Oslo Accords were signed, and Area C, which is most of the West Bank was supposed to be turned back, to a place where there are now over 600,000 settlers, and they're being armed by the defense minister of Israel and told to go out and kill Palestinians. And the situation is really, really dangerous, obviously. But we have to get control of it. And the biggest lesson of that is sort of the ripeness of diplomacy and the ripeness of deals you can make. I negotiated the Iran nuclear agreement, and we managed to make it ripe. We managed to, we found leadership that was ready to do it. We don't have that on either side now, on either side. I'm not blaming one and the other. We have to now get it.
China in that.
We now have to get into a really big, universally supported, major role for the Arab countries. They've got to come in, and we've got to rebuild, but with an understanding on the table of what you're rebuilding for and what the structure is going to be. And we have to build capacity. You have to take folks who don't have the school system, don't have the inputs, don't have the business, and build that. And all of us understand it's going to take a while. And if you do that, you could do that in good faith, okay, and make a difference.
As you'll understand, we could continue.
But you can't, let me just one last sentence. You can't do it while Iran is threatening, and you can't do it while Hezbollah is bombing. You have to tame the beast.
Understood.
To begin to be able to see a road ahead.
Thank you, John. As you can understand, we could talk for hours about many of these subjects. I would like to thank you for your openness and your truth here. I have always regarded John Kerry as being an outstanding global politician. You were very close to the presidency. The world might be very different now had we had President Kerry. It would have been different if we had won the All-Ireland in 2004 as well. But in any event, I want to thank you for that.
He sounds like a Red Sox fan.
Sure all the companies here appreciate what you've said. My final question is this. Given that I did 45 years in national politics, up and down, in and out, good times and bad times, you were on a much bigger scale. And given all of the sort of disillusionment and challenge and, antagonism and everything that's out there, John Kerry is still an optimist. So am I. Why are you an optimist?
President Obama used to say, John, you're being too optimistic. Well, I'm an optimist because of what I've been through in the course of my life, and I think I think that, first of all, I think in America we really do offer people the most extraordinary opportunity to change their lives, be what they want to be, and to...
As we know,
as you know, as you well know, and as Boston and Massachusetts knows as well as anybody. Secondly, this is human created, folks. I mean, we're dealing with stuff. It's not as if there's some sort of planet moving towards us that's going to explode or hit us or something. This is us. And it's us when we have better alternatives. And we're still not opting to do the things that we could do. But I'm optimistic. I think I've seen, look, I mean, millions less people are dying violently now than were in the last century. Health is better than it was. Long lives. Women's role in society, better, bigger. Still fighting, but changing. And I see this capacity for change. And I think it is that you don't have to be trapped by history. You can be liberated by it. Yeah. And I think that, I'll leave you just with this thought, folks. At the end of, in 1943, it was not clear that the Allies would win the war. And we still had to sort of meet the challenge of how do we get control of the air? How do we get control of the sea? So we can send the materials we need to be able to invade? How do we break Hitler's defenses up and down the coast? And there's a professor at Yale, Professor Paul Kennedy, who wrote a book, very small book, but enlightening to me. It's called The Engineers of Victory. And it writes about the way in which we actually met those challenges head on. we did get control of the seas, and we got control of the air. And at the end of the war, 1945, in a plant in Michigan that had been an automobile factory, we were turning out one B-24 bomber ready to fly every hour on the hour. We were turning out 3 Liberty ships every 2 days. That's the container ship of that time, and it brought the material over. And we learned with the Higgins boats and all these other things how to bust the defenses. And it was mid-level people who were unleashed on that challenge. That's what we need to do now.
Yeah.
Honestly, we have to treat this, it's so big, and it means major shifts in the economy. You all are poised to be the vanguard of that shift. And as it takes hold, as AI gets into the picture, AI is going to play a big role. Managing grids, transferring electrons and managing molecules. We can't even send a damned electron from New York to California today. We can map the Mars, we can do all these things. We can't do that, we can't do simple things. Texas has its own grid. We have an East Coast grid, a West Coast grid, a little line that goes across the Dakotas from Chicago. A big hole in the middle of our country. That can get fixed. There are jobs. We now have unbelievable new wire, that transmits, that does the transmission of electricity. And so you can go farther and have much more power.
Absolutely.
With much less loss in transition. We can do these things. That's what makes me optimistic. And I've seen what we do when we put our minds to either winning a war or changing something. That's why
Thank you, John. It reminds me of another a famous personality from your district in Massachusetts and Boston. In 1962, spoke to the American university students and said, if we cannot settle our differences sooner, let us at least make the world more ready for diversity. He said, for in the last analysis, our lowest common factor is that we all inhabit this planet, we all breathe the same air, we all cherish our children's futures, and we are all mortal.
Can I add to that?
Yes?
President Kennedy's inaugural address.
Yes.
Here on earth, God's work must truly be our own.
Let's finish on that. John Kerry, thank you very much. Global leader, wonderful person.